If you've dated an avoidant or fearful avoidant, then you're probably all too aware of the feeling of them pulling away. Sometimes it's a long time coming, other times it happens suddenly. Regardless of how it happened, there's a possible explanation for why it happened, and it all has to do with their triggers. My name is Charlie, and I'm also currently healing my fearful avoidant attachment style. So possible trigger number 1, when a potential long-term partner wants to get too close. This one is pretty straightforward. When somebody wants to increase intimacy within a relationship or connection, this can become uncomfortable for some avoidants and fearful avoidants. To be honest though, based on my own personal experience, I've only experienced this with anxious, preoccupied partners who not necessarily wanted to get too close, but they wanted to get too close too fast. I felt the speed at which intimacy was being pushed just felt really overwhelming. And it wasn't because I wasn't willing to be open with this person. It's just I feel like there's a certain amount of time that needs to be built up before I can be intimate or deeply personal with them. Now, for everyone, this will be different. And for some people, it may be so severe that it prevents them from forming healthy connections altogether. Trigger number 2 for many avoidants and FAs is being in a relationship that feels like it takes up a lot of time. Many avoidants and FAs cherish their personal time and their hobbies, and being in a relationship that takes up a lot of this time can eventually become really draining for them. This personal time actually helps them recharge emotionally and physically, and can really help them to miss their partners in connection. Trigger number 3, receiving criticism from family or loved ones. Anyone that's avoidant knows all too well where their hypersensitivity to criticism comes from. You see, many avoidants and FAs grew up in a household or environment with caregivers and family members that were very critical and emotionally unavailable. Over time, this caused them to close down to the people around them as a form of protection. They closed the doors to connection because the ones who were supposed to be there for them from the very beginning simply weren't. And lastly, trigger number 4, the fear of being vulnerable and rejected. So this can actually play off of the last trigger I just mentioned. Over time, avoidants can become afraid of being open with others because in the past, when they were vulnerable, they were met with rejection and shame in one way or another. If you've dated an avoidant or fearful avoidant, think back to a time in the past when you've both had an argument. Likely, if you're anxious, the argument started because you were fed up with something they were doing or not doing enough. And it's really important to consider those two, because if it's something that an avoidant is doing, they might interpret that as criticism. And if it's something that they're not doing enough, they will interpret that as criticism, but also rejection, because they might feel as if they are already trying. So it's possible that they interpret this as criticism and rejection, and possibly even argued back while sharing their side. And although this isn't a healthy form of vulnerability, it can still be seen as them sharing their own side and feelings. This is also where indirectly the anxious preoccupied person can reject the avoidant, because they'll often claim that if their partner had just showed up in the way that the anxious preoccupied person had liked, then they wouldn't be having this argument in the first place. But that right there is where the criticism lies. It immediately puts all of the blame from the argument on the avoidant person because they didn't show up in a way that resonated the most with you. Now, whether you've communicated your needs and have explained how you want them to show up is not what I'm invalidating by any means, and I'm not trying to throw shade at any style whatsoever. I'm simply trying to just illustrate in its rawest form the shared relationship between both the anxious and the avoidant, and how both sides equally play into the subconscious cycle that is known as the anxious avoidant dance. So these were 4 triggers of an avoidant attachment style. These aren't all of their triggers, and many triggers can often be very deeply personal and unique to the person you're dating. With that said, if you're somebody that actually wants to make a relationship work well with an avoidant, there's only so much you can do. The most important thing to always consider is when something comes up, Is your initial reaction one that is immediate and built on a lot of energy? Or are you taking the time to come up with a thoughtful, well-informed response? If we learn more to respond rather than react, we can actually form healthy relationships with an anxious and an avoidant person at the core of it. It takes a lot of understanding, a lot of patience, and a lot of communication. But it doesn't mean that it takes a lot of work if both people are showing up equally. That's the caveat here. Many anxious, preoccupied people like to learn about the avoidant attachment style as a means of winning someone back or trying to keep someone in their life. But if their avoidant is not receptive to hearing about this, and personally, there was a time when I kind of brushed off attachment theory as bullshit, believe it or not, you can actually get through to someone. It just takes time. There is only so much you can do. And you shouldn't stick around if you feel like your effort and energy isn't reciprocated. If being alone feels better for you, then I totally empower you to feel that way, no matter your attachment style. But what matters most is knowing when to cut your losses, because sometimes being alone is better. And being alone honestly helped me heal my attachment style.